However, although tensing up the whole structure isn't what we want and isn't the idea that's been handed down to us that we understand as whole body unified force, at that stage of development it does teach us something else that's really interesting and extremely useful. By definition, by the very nature of a tensed up structure, if we try to punch with one arm, it drags that side of the body a little bit forward with us. Because this is, after all, a form of connectivity, even if it's not the form of connectivity that we want in Chinese martial arts. So as our fist moves out, say the left fist, the left part of our body turns forward a little bit. And what we're doing here is discovering skewing the posture. And we're also discovering here something about balanced and unbalanced force. Because at first, following an ideology of balance, you might think that you should keep the whole body straight, punch with the arm, keep everything tense, and no part of the body should move. And you can think about that as a kind of paradigm based on the ideology of balance. So when the left side of your body, in this case, does move slightly forwards, you're contradicting the paradigm. And there's an idea that I use all the time in my academic work, where you reach a certain point where you come to a conclusion that seems to contradict everything that you've been saying, and it's a problem in the analysis. And that analysis up to that point is like a paradigm of thinking, and then you hit something and you think, well, hold on a minute, this really contradicts all of that, or it puts a block on that, or it stops that analysis in its track, and you think, well, where do I go from here? And these days, experience tells me that when I hit one of those points, what I'm really doing is moving into a different paradigm of thinking, that it's not a mistake, it's not a negative. There's something else, an entirely new way of thinking about what I'm doing that can emerge from that point. And as someone who's really interested in modern dance, particularly popping and locking, I always give this fantastic example of, if you don't know this, popping and locking, or significant element of popping and locking, was developed by a dancer called Don Campbell, and that's why we call it Campbell locking. And Don Campbell couldn't do the funky chicken, which is another kind of dance if you don't know that. And instead he was doing some weird movement, and people were laughing at it, and he was embarrassed with himself. And then the realization came, probably from someone else saying, wow, that's boss, teach me how to do that, that it's actually on the cusp of an entirely different paradigm, taking everything forward, leaving aside, leaving behind all that old paradigm, shifted into an entirely new way of thinking. Similarly, if you try and hold on to the idea of balance in this scenario, a balanced structure, then you're trapped within a paradigm that isn't really functioning. But if you embrace the idea that you're moving into a new paradigm and go with it, experiment with it, then you've happened upon the doorway into an entirely different paradigm that's going to take our movement onto the next level. Instead of attempting to hold the posture in balance, you go with the skew. And once you go with the skew, wonderful things start happening. First of all, you can get more of your whole body structure behind the punch, so you can include more of your body weight into the punch. You've increased the mass that's going to go into this equation of mass times velocity. Secondly, you can now manage distancing better. So not only can you compensate for the loss of reach that happened when you made your arm more crooked so that it wasn't quite as brittle, but you can use twisting around your spine axis to lengthen or shorten the length of a punch. And thirdly, you can now improve and modify bone alignment. So the more you twist at the spine axis, the more the angle of the arm in relationship to the shoulder flattens out, and the more that improves the bone alignment for a straight punch. And critically, you can do this very adaptively. You can change. There's a multitude of different, an infinity of different levels and degrees of twist that you can put into the skew. Whereas previously, where you were just tensing and sticking the arm out, you were stuck to one bone alignment only. Now you can change it. And that seemingly very simple thing then opens the doorway into understanding that the level and degree of body use that we're going to need as we build into the more advanced levels of the logical model requires a significantly higher level of neural engagement. That is, the way that the intent manages the movement and structure of the body. It's got to go on to an entirely different level with billions of calculations, whereas before it was a relatively simple thing just to stick your arm out. Now, I'm sure that as this was being developed, a few people insisted that you had to stick with the old way of doing it, but everyone else moved on into the new paradigm. We take what's useful, what we learned from the initial stages of the logical model, and we move on into the new paradigm where we can use skewing. We embrace the idea of skewing a posture. It's a level up across every aspect of our conceptualization and physical manifestation of wushu. But it brings with it all of those useful things that we've learned up to this point. But now we have to return to the previous problem that we left aside for a moment, and that's how to generate the velocity that we need to maximize force. We've got an anchored physical structure. We can get much more of our whole structure involved with it, and we can even do other things, by the way. Once we start to skew postures, we start to be able to use rooting, or a much more sophisticated form of rooting, because we're lengthening the posture by using skewing. Think about it physically as elongating, and that allows us to think about different points and how the feet connect to the ground and how they in turn are linked to the fist and so on. But for all of that, because we're still relying on this kind of whole body connectivity that's really just tensing our whole body, we've lost velocity. And we know from the initial stages of the logical model that power is going to be generated by muscles moving rapidly, and that's what we did when we first started punching with a floppy arm. So now we can use that information, apply it to the whole body, that we can get velocity by moving the whole body very fast. And it's just in the nature of our physical structure that we can intuitively feel that, for example, if we move quite rapidly around our spinal axis, what we call our spinal axis, remember, it's not exactly in line with the spine, but if we move around that central axis, that we can do exactly the same thing that we used to do with just one arm, but we can get our whole body involved with it. But how do we do that? Because we're tensing our whole body, so that rapidly slows down our ability to achieve our maximum velocity of movement. And our problem breaks into a few different branches here, and one of the branches is that we understand that actually we can get our velocity back just by making our structure floppier again. We could do the same thing that we used to do with our arm with our whole body, but then we've got the same problem again, that we can't transmit the force that we generate. However, what we do learn from doing that is that we can generate a massive amount more of kinetic force. So intuitively, we understand that we have to do that. If we want to maximize our production of kinetic force, then somehow we have to relax the whole structure to do that very fast movement around our vertical axis. And that's the first part of our problem. And the second part of the problem is, well, how then do we transmit that force that we generate to a target point, for example, a punch? To do that, somehow we need to tense the structure so that the force can be transmitted to the hit point. So how do we find the doctrine of the mean between these two things? And once you have that problem laid out like that, then the solution becomes again immediately intuitively obvious, that you can't just do the same movement within the whole posture. It's not going to be all floppy or all tense. It's got to be a relaxed movement first to generate the speed, and then at the last moment it's got to tense up so that the kinetic force generated can be transmitted to the hit point. In which case the technical difficulty of the posture has gone up to an entirely different level, because that's much more difficult than just throwing your arm out in a floppy structure, and it's much more difficult than just being tense. You've got to do one and then immediately transition to the other. And we also know, by the way, that because of the reality of the context of the fight, that we can't just have a floppy structure waiting to throw out a punch that will then just tense at the last minute. The opponent is going to be hitting us, kicking us, and we need to have some kind of defensive ability. And our basic defensive ability, beyond footwork, which is the most basic defensive capability of all, is a springy structure that's going to be resilient against strikes. So we can't just have a floppy structure. So that's another consideration that we have to factor into the equation. We're going to have to move from a relatively springy structure, by which we mean tension, some degree of tension across the musculature, into then some kind of relaxed but fast movement to generate velocity that's going to feed into the mass times velocity equation. And then we're going to have to tense the posture right at the last minute to transmit the force generated. And then we're going to have to relax back into the springy overall structure. And then in the context of the reality of the fight, we find that this thing is overdetermined. That is, there are multiple different reasons why we want to go in this direction and how it all links together holistically. So for one, we need to move fast to generate velocity. In fact, we want to be as relaxed as we possibly can to create as much velocity as we possibly can. And at the same time, we want to draw in as much of our body mass as we possibly can into that equation. And that's going to maximize our ability to generate force. But to do that, we're going to have to relax our structure. And the moment we relax our structure, it's a little bit like on Star Trek, where they drop the shields and become vulnerable. The minute you relax your structure, then you're highly vulnerable. You've got no defense. So you've got to do that so fast as you possibly can. So this is what we mean by overdetermined. Fast helps you get more power. Fast is also tactically better. So we need to learn how to do that in a split second. And similarly, at the hit point, we need to just be in contact long enough to be able to transmit the force. And then we need to relax back into our overall springy structure. Because at the hit point, when we tense, that's quite a brittle structure and that's vulnerable in its own way. And we need to return back to the doctrine of the mean. And all of that's got to happen in a split second. And of course, what we're describing here is Fa Li. And what we're now developing is a skill, an art, something that's going to take time to practice and develop. And what we need to think about is, what's the best way of doing that? And in the logical model, the best way of doing that, first of all, is to think about the mistakes of the past. So think about those people who just tense up their whole body and confuse that with whole body unified force. And we're going to have to do something much more sophisticated. We're going to have to think about a complex interaction of tension and relaxation across different points of the body in a dynamic system. And what we're moving towards here is an understanding of the generation of power in martial arts, what we might call fist power, what Yiquan, for one, calls fist power. And he makes a distinction between just having muscles and then being able to use those muscles in an interactive system to generate force. Force that is relevant to martial arts. So Yiquan says, quote, "Firstly, let's analyse the first question. Modern science tells us that in researching anything, we must grasp the contradictions within that thing itself. As we can deduce from the aforementioned analogy, when we move a certain limb, we must relax the muscles of one system while contracting those of another. This holds true for exertion as well. If the muscular system is completely relaxed, one is naturally powerless. Yet, if the conflicting systems are both contracted simultaneously, even though the muscles are in a state of tension, the interference and mutual cancellation between the two systems results in a lack of effort or a weak effect on the external environment. Some individuals might feel that they are exerting great force, but achieving minimal outcomes. This is the principle at play. For movements that we are familiar with in daily life, a precise neural control due to proficiency minimises interference in the conflicting system or results in minor interference, thereby allowing the physical strength to be effectively exerted. However, in unfamiliar or unpracticed postures or movements, when force is applied, inaccurate or chaotic neural control can occur, causing both conflicting systems to contract simultaneously. Consequently, the majority of physical strength is offset by internal contradictions, and the strength is not fully utilised. This is especially true during moments of instantaneous force application, where there isn't sufficient time to gradually adjust various body parts, thereby accentuating the inaccuracy of neural control. In summary, when exerting force, the muscles and tendons of various body parts must coordinate in tension and relaxation. Failing to achieve this will lead to interference or even total negation of one's own strength. This is why ancient Chinese martial artists generalized fist power as tension and relaxation don't overdo either, and they even went as far as considering that the fundamental issue of martial arts lies in this balance. End quote. And out of all of that, think about that point Han Zihuang's making about doing all of this in a fast moment, i.e. the difficulty of doing this under the stress of combat, where you've got to hit fast, you've got to use Farley, you've got to react, you've got to manage the interaction of relaxation and tension across multiple different muscles, across the whole system, and in the context of a particular posture under stress, and how difficult all of that is. And of course, some of that skill, for example, managing stress under something like a fight situation, that's going to come from experience through sparring and doing things like that. As Han Zihuang himself tells us, the highest expression of Yiquan as a training practice is sparring. But what he's getting at in this discussion, of course, is why we practice standing. Standing is the mechanism through which we begin to train a much higher ability to control the contrasting elements of relaxation and tension. And that's why Han Zihuang is talking about the way that we can do this normally with tasks that we're very familiar with, we work very efficiently. In many cases, we could add to that and say that just because of the nature of things and the way that we work and the way that we live our lives, we might be doing something efficiently, but sometimes we're doing it in ways that are bad for us. So the way that we sit at a desk or behind the wheel, whatever kind of job you do, however that forces you into one of the evil zhuangs, that can be damaging for you. But either way, we become efficient at tasks that we're normally used to, even if they have some negative contexts. And Han Zihuang's argument is that standing becomes a habitual task, but it's a special kind of habitual task that's a step before all other tasks. And within that step before, that kind of it's like the stem cells of movement. And it makes the sophisticated use, not just standing. So Han Zihuang, of course, as we've talked about before, tells us that it's got to be combined with movement and other kinds of training. But we start by stripping all of that back to just directly training the contradictory relationship between different groups of muscles. And then step by step, we build that into a much more sophisticated relationship of the overall system of the body. All the different muscles of the body working together in an incredibly complex system. And from there, interlinking that with movement, bone alignment, and all the other elements of training, thinking about what a sophisticated system that is. We make it our daily task. That's why we do daily standing. We make it our daily task to be able to do that, so that we can be just like the farmer who's exerting less power than the muscular youth who's used to doing that kind of work. So the kind of work that we need for issuing force in Farley or using it for martial arts, that's second nature to us. That's what we've been training day by day. And of course, all martial arts do that. That's not the argument that that's the only way of doing it. The idea is that standing is a shortcut and it's considerably less damaging to the body. It gets to the end point quicker. If you combine it with the other kinds of martial arts training, it can get you to the end point quicker with significantly less damage and wear and tear on the overall body. And once we've developed that interconnectivity that we call whole body unified force, which is really just the advanced stage of where that whole musculature begins to knit together as a system, then we come back to this idea of a unified structure. We come back to these ideas of anchored postures, but they're anchored in a completely different way. It's not just through tension, it's through a very sophisticated network of relaxation and tension that ripples through the entire structure. So how do we do that? Well, we use visualization and standing to bring those processes into conscious awareness. And again, Han Zihuang says, we normally, as martial artists, have those contradictions going on in our body, but they are very chaotic and we don't have control over them, so we need to bring them into conscious awareness, and from there we can train and work on them. But it's probably more useful to let Han Zhuang speak to himself, so I'll give another quote here to finish off this segment. Martial arts training requires the practitioner to consciously define various opposing systems and fully bring them under conscious neural control. This process transforms disruptive aspects into favourable factors, aligning them to serve a specific state of exertion. Those who reach this level do not simply employ techniques like pulling, pushing, pressing or lifting. Rather, with the assistance of certain muscle systems, they enable their different body parts to cooperate according to martial arts requirements. This form of cooperation is referred to as integrity in martial arts terminology. From this perspective, integrity is a state of utilising strength, the embodiment of harmonious martial arts strength, hence it naturally varies in degrees. The connectedness state might be regarded as an initial stage of integrity, while the advanced stage of comprehensive utilisation of contradictions forms the higher level of integrity. Over several years of training, one crucial task for martial artists is to attain integrity under various movement conditions and to continuously enhance it. As a side note, with the improvement of the integrity state, practitioners will have a distinct sense of it, which can also be reflected in their appearance. More advanced individuals can observe the progress and deficiencies of trainees through their physical appearance. End quote. Which I think is one of the really important things about Yiquan. There's a few people I've seen, well, there's a good reason for them saying this, i.e. they can't really do Yiquan themselves, but they say things like the principles of Yiquan are invisible. And I think it's important to emphasise that that's not true. That's just something that people say when they haven't got them. So obviously they would say, as Christine Keeler said, they would say that, wouldn't they? Not only does Han Zhuang say that, but Han Xingqiao. Or there's an interview, I think it's with Han Xingqiao, might be with Han Xingqiao and Han Xingyuan at a very early stage of their martial arts career where they're running a school in China. They do a newspaper interview where they say you can tell just by looking at someone their level of particularly whole body unified force, and that's absolutely true.